the people around us that we belong to you. Thank you, Father God. Thank you for all the blessings. This we pray in your mighty name. Amen.
Might you stand? I'm in my sorrow and dead in my sin. Lost without hope and no place to begin. Love me in a way that mercy come in. I was buried beneath my shame. Who could carry that kind of weight? It was my tomb till I met you. I was breathing but not alive. All my failures I tried to hide. It was my tomb till I met you. When you called my name, I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness, into your glorious day. You called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness, into your glorious day. Now your mercy has saved my soul. Now your freedom is all that I know. The old thing new, and I met you. You called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness, into your glorious day. You called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness, into your glorious day. I needed rescue, my sin was heavy, the chains break and the weight of your glory. I needed shelter, I was an orphan. Now you call me a citizen of heaven. When I was broken, you were my healing. Now your love is the air that I breathe in. I have a future, my eyes are open. 'Cause when you call my name, I ran out that grave, out of the darkness, into your glorious day. You called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness, into your glorious day. You be seated. As we come into our time of prayer, there is a number of families I know here that are hurting a lot. We have a special prayer to lift up for those who are dealing with mental health issues, that are struggling, and loved ones
don't exactly know what's going on and what's going to happen. We have more than one family that's dealing with a situation very much like that. We'd like to lift up. Also like to lift up a prayer for a man by the name of Dan Kern, rehabbing in St. Mary's in Rochester, has been diagnosed with a brain tumor. Maria, you handed me this, right? This morning's been a little bit of a blur. Was that right? You know this person?
Yes.
So we'll lift up Dan. Also take the time to invite the ushers to come forward. Father, you are good. You love us, you care for us, you protect us. You are our light in the darkness, even when times are difficult, when we're struggling. We know that you're there. Father, we know how difficult mental health issues can be, how much darkness there seems to be in those situations, but we know that you can be in the light in those dark places. We pray that you would be with those situations. We pray that you would be with all of those who are struggling with their thoughts, with their decision making. We pray that you would bring them peace, bring them comfort. Pray that you would show your light to them, help them to see that even in those times where they feel so alone and so lost and so angry, that you're standing there beside them, that you're weeping with them, that you love them. We pray that you would encourage and uplift those around who are having difficult times. We pray that you would be with those situations. We pray that you would pour your love on us, on all of us, that we would see your goodness and that we would share that goodness with those around us. We also know so many, it seems like every week we find out about somebody else who's dealing with this horrible disease of cancer. We pray that you'd be with Dan. We pray that you would bring healing and peace to him with his tumor. We pray that you'd be with the surgery he has this week. We pray that you'd be with all those who are struggling. We pray that you'd be with our schools and our children as we're all ramping up for a school year, where things will continue to get more and more busy, and it doesn't seem like things ever slow down, but we know that you're in control. You're guiding us as individuals, as a church family, as a church organization, as a community, as a country. We pray that you would move powerfully with us and in us. Now as we take a moment to take an offering where we have the opportunity to worship you by trusting you, by giving a little bit of what you've given to us, knowing that you will continue to provide even when it seems difficult. We pray that you would bless that. We pray that you bless the givers. We pray that you bless the money that is taken, that it would be used to powerfully move forward your kingdom. Be with us and bless us. In your name we pray. Amen.
We all, like sheep, have gone astray and kind of forgotten what we're supposed to do, so. But it's a good thing we have a gracious God,
Or
right?
he was just easily confused.
No, I didn't even know that was here.
I was just kind of enjoying sitting here watching the different expressions.
I'm just shy.
We invite you to stand with us as we continue on in worship.
You're the calm.
If you have your Bibles, I'd invite you to open to Luke chapter 7. And if your name is Timmy, I would invite you to come forward. I have to think of that because it's twice in a row, isn't it? I think I had you come and read for me 2 weeks ago. So we're continuing on in our study through the parables. Today's parable is the parable of the two debtors, Luke chapter 7. He's going to read verses 36 to 50. It will be once you start talking. That's not in there. There's no on.
One of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and reclined at table. And behold, a woman of the city, who was a sinner, when she learned that she was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment, and standing behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, and wiped them with the hair of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. And Jesus answering, he said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he answered, say it, teacher. A certain money lender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii, and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now which of them would love him more? Simon answered, The one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. And he said to him, You have judged rightly. Then turning towards the woman, he said to Simon, Do you see this woman? I entered your house. gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears, and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. She loved much, but who is forgiven little loves little. And he said to her, your sins are forgiven. Then those who were at the table began to say among themselves, who is this, who even forgives sin? And he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace.
You are getting to be an expert at that. Maybe we're going to have to make this an every week thing. Yeah, that's why Timmy stopped coming to church. I'm joking. I'm not going to do that to you, probably. So, oftentimes when I have an errand or two to run towards the end of the afternoon, I grab Keely and we run off and do errands together. And they have a list of places now that they are growing to get very, very excited about running errands with Daddy to. These places include the bank, the gas station, and the insurance office. That seems like a strange list, doesn't it? Well, there is a common denominator among these three locations. Candy. Boy, you got it. Winner. 3 points for you. Go to the bank. Every teller window has a candy dish. The desk on the side has a bigger candy dish. And half the time they remember this, half the time they forget. There's usually a whole jar of cookies off to the side. We go to the gas station. Oftentimes, when we go pay for the gas, I get those little 5-cent sweet tart suckers for the girls, and they just go crazy. And then the insurance office, and boy, could we talk about weeks like today, how little fun it is to go to the insurance office when certain people are gone. Out front of the insurance office, there's a little machine. It's very tricky. You put your hand under the machine, and it spits M&Ms at you. Keely hasn't quite got the timing down yet, so usually Jeff has to clean up M&Ms all over his office, but she gets a kick out of it either way. They have grown to love going to those places because they know when they go to those places, they're going to get something that they want. And I think there's a recognition there that we need to catch on to. When we're given something, when we get something that we want, we're typically appreciative of it, and it makes us want that or love that or care about that more. When we don't appreciate that, we typically recognize that as a problem, right? When we don't appreciate something, that's an ungrateful person. We look down on those people, we chastise those people, we try not to be ungrateful ourselves. When we understand what we're getting, when we really want what we're getting, we tend to appreciate it. And when we take something for granted, we lose that appreciation. We lose that care, that love. That's the idea that Jesus is getting at in this parable. And it's interesting that this parable is set in a larger story. A lot of times we have these parables that are kind of sit on their own. I like this one because there's a whole context to it that we can look at. So, starting in verse 36, one of these Pharisees asked Jesus to come eat with him. We find out later that this Pharisee's name is Simon. Now, eating together in that culture is sort of the same as ours, and I think really every culture ever. Eating together is an opportunity to connect socially, an opportunity to communicate, to ask questions, to connect with somebody. For a Pharisee to sit down and share a meal with somebody, that is their opportunity. They take those times to ask questions, to challenge each other theologically, to grow in their thinking. It's an intentional developmental time for them. They did this regularly. So this is showing that Simon has a level of respect for Jesus. He wants to talk to him. He wants to connect with him. He wants to understand him and to share some ideas on theology, on God. Who is God? So we see that there's a base level of respect there. But we're going to see that respect is going to get challenged a little bit as we go. Because we have this whole scene that shows up. Verse 37, behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she learned that he was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment. And standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, and wiped them with the hair of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with the ointment. Now, this is a scene that we see several different times in the Gospels. So we're sort of challenged to figure out, is this the same that we see recorded in some of the other books, or is this a really bizarre situation that happens more than once to Jesus? Well, you can kind of go back and forth. Anytime you have a situation like this written by different people, you're getting different accounts. You know, remember, Luke wasn't there. Luke questioned people. He got accounts from other people, so he's recording what they saw, what they remember. So it's possible that they're all the same, even though there are slight differences in them. It's also very possible that this weird thing happened to Jesus more than once. What does this look like? Well, it says he's reclining at the table. In the Middle East, in the ancient Middle East, they did meals, they did tables differently. The tables aren't like this, where they're up high and you'd sit in a chair underneath them. They're usually right down on the ground, just raised slightly. There'd be pillows around it. And Jesus would sort of lean on an elbow with his head and his shoulder next to the table, so as he's eating, he could grab and eat kind of one-handed like this, while his feet then would be pointed out. Now that was just for one, out of convenience, because that would be for them a relatively comfortable place to sit. But also, there's this whole cultural thing in Jesus' day of feet. And they're gross. There's a lot of people who think feet are gross already. But there are several cultures around the world that they have strong aversions to feet, and this is one of them. There's some good reasons for that. They tended to walk on a lot of dusty and muddy roads that would be shared with animals. So all that dust and mud wasn't just dust and mud, if you track what I mean there. And that would get all over their feet. You want to walk in on the carpet on bare feet with that? They wouldn't. So they keep the feet away. They don't touch their feet. They don't touch other people's feet. We ran into this when we did some work with Asian refugees in the cities, where in that culture, if you were to show the bottom of your foot to somebody, it's a huge insult. So we'd sit, around a circle on the floor in youth group, and you just have your feet in the middle of the circle. These little Asian kids are scared and start to feel terrible because they think you're telling them that you hate them. No, that's not it. So feet are gross. They're dirty and they're dusty. That's why oftentimes when you go visit somebody's house, they provide a basin of water next to the door so you can wash off your feet. One, that's just kind of nice to have a little refreshment there. Two, you don't smell. And three, you're not going to track that through the house. So he would be sitting like that. His feet would be pointed out. All of the attention would be focused in. But then all of a sudden it says this woman of the city shows up. And she's from the city. It means she's known. The people around know who she is. But then she's also described as a sinner. That's not just a broad theological statement that, this woman is a sinner, Greg is a sinner. We'll leave it at that. See, I'm trying to transition here. Off of he, back to Greg. It means that these people knew her lifestyle. They knew this woman's lifestyle, and she wasn't godly. She wasn't interested in religious things. Typically speaking, we attach this phrase to prostitutes. We don't know that for sure, but there's several details here that would sort of point to the idea that this was a prostitute that walked in to a Pharisee's house, a high, holy religious leader's house. That is going to get everybody's attention immediately. She brings with her this alabaster jar of ointment of perfume. This would be a very, very small stoneware jar that would have been sealed, not reusable. It's a one-time use thing. It's very expensive. It would be something that prostitutes would have and they would use in their line of work. But instead of using it in sin, she brings it in. Instead of going to the table, she goes to Jesus' feet and she weeps. She just begins crying. And she she lets her tears fall on his feet, and she uses those tears to wash all of that gunk off of Jesus' feet. And then she uses her hair to wipe them clean and to wipe them dry, meaning all of that gunk that he didn't have a chance to clean off at the door, we find out later. It's covering her face, her hair, her body. And she begins kissing his feet. And then she covers them with this expensive perfume. And with the cultural aversion that they would have towards feet, that would be an even more humbling and humiliating act than we could understand if we were to try and picture that situation ourselves. And so, as I said, this doesn't go unnoticed by the room. People see this. Verse 39, now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she's a sinner. Jesus answered and said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he answered, say it, teacher. So I think this is interesting that this starts out where it says, Simon said it to himself. It means there's a couple of options here. One, he just sort of muttered it and Jesus happened over here, which frankly I think is the least likely option. Two, he literally says it to himself and Jesus sort of reads his mind. That happens. That is expressly said, and Jesus does that once or twice in other places. It's possible that happened here. The third option, which this might be our cultural interpretation because this is a very Minnesota thing to do. He passive-aggressively says it to himself loud enough so that everybody in the room hears it because he's trying to make a point. That, again, it might just be the Bart's interpretation because I'm Minnesotan, but that seems likely. But whatever the option is there, Jesus hears that statement and he launches into this parable. So we saw at the beginning that Simon had respect for Jesus. We see here that it seems like he's losing some respect for Jesus, but it's worth noting that in verse 40, Jesus is referred to by Simon as teacher. Didaskalos is the Greek word, means rabbi. It's an honorary title to the people. He is recognizing Jesus as a teacher, as a legitimate leader, religious leader in the community. So we're seeing Simon is apparently one of the good Pharisees, or at least one of the better Pharisees. So Jesus takes that, launches into the parable. A certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii, the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now, which of them will love him more? So we keep going into the money analogies with parables. Jesus does that a lot. Like I said, the two topics that Jesus teaches with the most are money and hell. I think it's significant that most churches tend to not touch either of those things when that's the majority of what Jesus uses. But he launches into another one of these parables about money. Denarii, remember, is essentially a 1 day's wage. It's what one family needs to live for a single day. I also wish that we had more experiences with money like Jesus uses in the parables. People are always getting loads of money for people, or they're having these massive debts forgiven. That would be really cool if that happened more often. But in this here, we have these two people, they're lent money, 150, which means it's about a month and a half's worth of wages that he owes. That's not a small amount. But the other's 500. That's well over a year and a half's worth of wages that's owed. The first would be difficult. The 50 would be difficult to pay back. The 500 for the average person would be very nearly impossible to ever hope to pay that back. So very simple, he lays that out, and then he asks the key question at the end. Who will love the money lender more? Who is going to be more appreciative of what they're receiving? Simon gives the obvious answer. The one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. That just makes sense, right? Somebody who's forgiven 75 grand is going to be more thankful than somebody who's forgiven 5 grand. That makes sense to us. So then Jesus takes that and brings this analogy home. And turning towards the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, But she's wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she's not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she's anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore I tell you, this is the key verse, therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little. And he said to her, your sins are forgiven. Now in that, if you pick up on what's happening in the situation, Jesus does something that is rude, bordering on highly offensive. He's comparing a Pharisee, a holy religious leader respected by the entire community, to a prostitute, and not favorably. He's lifting up the prostitutes above him. The Pharisee had left out a couple of common symbols of hospitality, the water and the kiss. The water was just a common way to greet people, and a kiss would be a respected greeting, welcome into the house. This prostitute is going so far in how she's honoring Jesus that it would have been seen as extremely obscene if she weren't weeping the entire time she's doing it. What's the difference between the two? Well, the difference is, as I said, that key verse, verse 47. Now, there could be some controversy with this because some people are going to grab on this and they're going to twist it. They're going to make it say something that's just not biblical. Because there is the potential in this one isolated verse for some misinterpretation. Comes with that last phrase in verse 47, for she loved much. The word for, it's the Greek word hoti. I'm pulling out a few Greeks today. Feeling fancy. It's a conjunction. It means it's a connecting word. It's a word that connects one phrase to another phrase. All of a sudden I realize I have to really pretend like I know what I'm talking about now because there's somebody who actually knows something about languages back there and I'm not going to look at her. So it's a connecting word that means for or because. So she loved much for, now where does that connect to? What is the verb that is supposed to go along with that phrase? If it's connecting that phrase, for she loved much, to the verb forgiven, then we may have a problem, and that's where some people are going to take this. Because if she's forgiven because she loved much, why is she forgiven? Because she earned it. All you have to do is love and you will be forgiven. All you have to do is show this act. We see all throughout the New Testament, in many places that Jesus says himself, and much of Paul's writing, and in various other places, that we can't be saved through our actions. We can't be saved through the things we do. That's what we sometimes refer to as works theology. You don't get to go to heaven because you show up to church. You don't get to go to heaven because you raised your hand during the worship service and everybody thought you were weird, because that's what happens. By the way, I don't think you're weird. You don't get to heaven because you served as an usher X number of weeks. It makes it very clear in many places in the Bible that's just not how it works. We owe such a debt that there's nothing that we can do to earn that forgiveness. So what's the other option here? Well, there's another verb that hoti could be connecting back to. That's the verb tell. Which means this is a context statement. We can see that her many sins are forgiven. Why? Because we can see how much she loves. How much she appreciates it. How she has received it. We often talk about salvation by grace through faith as a free gift. We say that you cannot earn salvation. Just went through that. I often point to the verse in Romans where it says, believe and you will be saved, and that's it. And that's absolutely true. Those are fair. But, and I've appreciated Steve because he reminds me that there's always another side of a coin. We can't just leave it there. We're saved by grace through faith. There's nothing we can do, but it doesn't stop there. Sometimes we want to put things in boxes. And this is one of these things that we want to put in a box. We're saved as a free gift. There's nothing we can do. Box here. I have to earn my salvation. I have to do these things to be saved. I have to do these things to go to heaven. We'll put those boxes there. And it's one or the other. And Jesus, I don't think, does that. He clearly says you can't earn salvation. He clearly says there's nothing you can, that you are saved as a free gift. But at the same time, there are things that go together. We can affirm the fact that we can't be saved by anything that we do. We can't ignore that works go along with a saving faith. We have the 5 solas that are still up on the wall. We've been talking forever about switching them out and putting something else up there, but these are the pillars of Martin Luther's Reformation, 2 of them. Sola fide, sola gratia. By grace alone, through faith alone. But the Reformer said, but when you're saved by grace alone, through faith alone, it doesn't remain alone. Here's what Martin Luther, the chief reformer, says himself. Faith cannot help doing good works constantly. It doesn't stop to ask if good works ought to be done, but before anyone asks, it already has done them and continues to do them without ceasing. Anyone who does not do good works in this manner is an unbeliever. Thus, it is just as impossible to separate faith and works as it is to separate heat and light from fire. I like that analogy. This woman is not saved because of her actions, but her actions flow out of the gratefulness that she's saved in. Luther's words echo, oddly enough, the book of the Bible that he hated the most, the book of James. He struggled with this, but I think he came around to it, because this is what James says. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. There's a couple of big statements there. The question, can it save him? The statement, that faith is dead. Those are statements that are referring to somebody who's going to hell. Take joy in saying that, but it is the truth. A faith that does not express itself in life is dead. A claim of salvation without some form of outward change, a lifestyle that's lived in faith, a lifestyle that's lived focused on love for God, for a Savior that saved us, that's no salvation at all. So verse 47 in Luke, why are her sins forgiven? Her sins are forgiven not because of love itself, but because of the object of her love and her devotion. Because of Jesus Christ. She recognized that. Moving on in the parable, in the story. Then those who were at the table with him began to say amongst themselves, who is this that even forgives sins? And who said, and he said to the woman, your faith has saved you, go in peace. How does the room react to this? The hearers blow past the significance of all that's happening, of the faith of this woman, of what Jesus has said, and they simply say, who is it that can even forgive sins? They just miss the whole point. And I love how Jesus reacts to it. He just ignores it. Just ignores, and he focuses on this woman and her amazing faith. Because they've all missed the point. Simon thought he was righteous. He was a Pharisee, after all. That's what they were. Kind of definition. Pharisee, righteous. We can give him a little credit. We said he's one of the good Pharisees. So maybe Simon would be willing to say, yes, I'm flawed, yes, I make mistakes. But he's still going to say, but I'm generally okay. Generally speaking, I'm pretty good. This woman knew the depths of her sin. She recognized that deep, insurmountable debt that she owed to a holy and a righteous God. That sin that she recognized then caused her to weep, to mourn, to grieve. She knew the pain that came with that sin. And in that grief, she met a Savior. and she threw himself at his feet. There was no groveling, there was no humiliation that was too great at that moment, because she believed that that man could make a way for her forgiveness. She was absolutely right. But Simon, he may have recognized his flaws, but he didn't feel the weight of his sin. And while by our standards his sin likely wasn't as great as this woman's, in the eyes of a holy, righteous God, his sin was ugly. His sin was death. This reminds me of another parable, and I was glad that it fits in here, because we'd intended to, or originally at the beginning of the series, to preach this parable last week, and we shifted some things around. It's a short one, but I think it's incredibly powerful. It's in Luke chapter 18. Mention it briefly here. It goes like this. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. And the Pharisee goes up to the front. He stands by himself and he prays out loud. God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. Pharisees had a tendency to do this. They use big words. They're up front. They do out loud. You have to kind of ask the question, who are they praying to? Is that prayer really to God, or is that prayer to anybody around that can hear it? Look how good I am. But then I think this is the powerful part of the story. He pointed at that tax collector. He said, but the tax collector, standing far off, wouldn't even look his eyes up to heaven, but he beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful on me, a sinner. These stories parallel each other. The tax collector, the prostitute, they knew their sin. They recognized the weight of their sin. And they cried out for mercy. And guess what? They were heard. Because God loves us. He wants to grant us mercy. Not in the midst of our pride. Not when we're puffing ourselves up saying, look how good I am. So it brings us to us. Where are you? Are you standing at the altar? Say, I'm a sinner, but at least I'm not like him, her, them. Are we standing in humility, saying, have mercy on me? It's the only hope that we have. The only hope that we have is in the mercy and the grace and compassion of God. Are we mourning the fact that we're sinners? Pray with me. Father, you are so good and you are so holy. We are so not. We can play the comparison game. We can say, I'm not like this person, I'm not like that person. At least I'm. You tell us we're not compared to each other, we're compared to you. Compared to you, we are all just horribly depraved sinners that are in need of forgiveness and love. I pray that you would humble us. I pray that you would remind us that as righteous as we may want to pretend like we are dead. We are dead in our sin, but we can have the opportunity for life in you. And as we move into this time of communion, I pray that we would remember that. That you are the one who has died so that we may rise again. In your name we pray. Amen. So, at the beginning of the week, before a lot of conversations, before a lot of discussions, I laid out today's service with this interesting theme of death. Christians from the outside looking in sometimes look a little funny because we talk so much about death, blood. It's terrible. It's not. Something we talked about the last couple weeks at the fair service, this idea that through death, we have the hope of life. Because sin brings death. Sin brings the punishment of death. But when we identify, as we said at the fair service, when we identify with Christ on the cross, we are crucified with him, we are buried with him. That means we get to rise with him too. From death brings life. And that's why we talk about blood. Blood, which normally, a nice white shirt like Todd's, cover that in blood, it's not going to be nice and white anymore. But the blood of Jesus purifies everything. It says it makes us white as snow. And that's what we remember in communion. The body that's broken for us, the blood that is shed for us, for our forgiveness of sins, for our hope of eternity in heaven. So if we have sins that we haven't brought and laid on the altar before God and asked for forgiveness, we need to do that. If we recognize that our lives don't reflect the decision that we've claimed inside, we need to lay that before him too. We need to say that there is nothing but us at the feet of Jesus, weeping and mourning and knowing that because of our faith we can be forgiven. The Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, he took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you." He didn't die for his own sake. He didn't die because he had to. He died because he chose to, because he loved us. And what do we need to do? We need to receive that gift. Christ's body broken for you. Take in remembrance of him. cup is the new covenant in Jesus' blood. Do this in remembrance of him. Invite you to stand and join us in our closing hymn. It's just a beautiful hymn with some amazing, powerful images, and just keep running through your head. Christ died for me. voice would be our song through the whole of our lives. I pray that we would remember that your blood has power to save us, to redeem us, to bring us to you.